October 23rd, 1962, 14:30 hours Eastern Time. The Atlantic Ocean, 15 nautical miles north of the Bahamas. According to recently verified intelligence reports, Soviet missile sites capable of delivering nuclear warheads are being constructed in Cuba. In breach of our agreements and accords with the USSR, these installations pose an immediate and unacceptable threat to the United States. President Kennedy today ordered a naval quarantine of the island to prevent further delivery of offensive military equipment. The Soviets know exactly what they're doing, and they know they're in breach of these agreements, to which violent prosecution and retaliation is justified. Task Force 22, a group of 2 Gearing-class destroyers, Brownson and Power, led by the Galveston, a missile cruiser, is on station 277 miles north of Cuba's shoreline, the north-northeast edge of the quarantine zone, managing the blockade. The blockade has to be maintained, and if breached, Soviet forces must be engaged as a necessary escalation to prevent this nuclear proliferation at all costs. Task Force 22 will identify all vessels entering and exiting the Cordon. They will communicate intent to any Soviet-flagged vessels and will prosecute as needed and accordingly. Additionally, intelligence suggests possible Soviet warship escorts with the latest group of merchant transports, indicating the Soviets know well what they're getting into and are placing an insurance policy on their most valuable haulers. While Task Force 22 performs sweeps along the quarantine zone, a P-3C Orion maritime patroller departs Jacksonville Naval Air Station in Florida and makes for the Cordon, performing a radar sweep of the area as we brace for the armed merchant fleet. Around 14:33, the Brownson's surface search radar picks up a diesel-powered track on a direct course for the quarantine, traveling at 7 knots, and it's not long after that they visually identify the track as a Soviet merchant vessel. 15 minutes later, the USS Brownson and Galveston gain visual contact with the vessel. The communist-class cargo vessel can carry over 12,000 tons of cargo, and whatever is on board, the ship is closing at speed, now just 16 nautical miles from the quarantine. Another pair of unidentified diesel-powered merchants are detected about 30 miles off the port flank of the Soviet vessel. The Brownson moves to identify them, while the Galveston holds course and attempts to deter the Soviet vessel, communicating the imminent blockade breach and the consequences. The message is broadcast in Russian and English. The Orion now enters the rough airspace of the blockade, picking up several more radar echoes in the area. It closes in as the job of properly identifying each and every one of these contacts unfolds. Complicating this, the USS Power picks up electromagnetic emissions to its north, signaling the probable arrival of Soviet warships. The first Soviet merchant refuses to reply. The USS Galveston attempts again and again, tracking the vessel all the way to the point where the merchant begins to cross the quarantine. The Galveston engages with its 127mm guns, preventing the crossing and initiating the first contact of this conflict. The Soviet ship grinds to a halt shortly thereafter, and fire consumes it. Meanwhile, the Orion attached to TF-22 starts IDing some of the merchant tracks. The first is an American oil tanker making a pass through the Bahamas. Another Soviet warship is detected, but the EM signatures are fuzzy this far out. Probably a destroyer based on the SIG. The Orion IDs the next merchant as a US-based container ship, hauling along a similar line as the tanker. The one after that, a Brazilian cargo hauler with a Florida-bound trajectory. And another as a British hauler making for Nassau. The first of the Soviet warships is identified, a Kashin-class destroyer and an unknown number of other escort ships. They're making a beeline for the blockade. Their intent is clear. They refuse communications from the Galveston, and they seem unfazed by the sinking of the other merchant. Probably because the Galveston and Brownson are at such range from them. Their current position is bearing down on the lone USS Power as it investigates a cluster of 3 likely Soviet vessels approaching the quarantine. One is cleared as an English ship, but the other 2 are confirmed. Another pair of Soviet haulers are about to break the cordon. The inbound Soviet destroyer carries SAN-1 Goa SAMs, which are a threat to my Orion, but otherwise only have a range of 16 nautical miles. It's been an hour since the first contact with the Soviet blockade runners. Continued attempts to deter Soviet advance are met with silence. All ships continue their approach, while Task Force 22 attempts to collapse formation to present a unified front against the inbound warships. Another half-hour later, and the situation has developed further. The Orion has passed several more tracks as neutral transports and deep-sea fishing trawlers. Once again, the Galveston issues a warning to all Soviet merchants and warships, and prosecution is delayed until the last possible moments as the vessels approach the line. The USS Power shadows them all the way, ready to engage. Suddenly, the Power's passive sonar picks up 2 inbound torpedoes just 2 miles off the starboard side. Powell banks hard to port, dropping a noisemaker and cutting to 2/3 power. Retaliation picks up. The Orion dives to 1,000 feet and plots a sonobuoy drop pattern around the initial contact point of the torpedoes. The Galveston picks up to flank speed and moves to intercept the enemy warships. The Power drops 2 Mark 46 torpedoes in the water to spook the Russian sub into dropping a noisemaker, maybe giving itself away. It then turns to bombard both nearby hostile transports with guns. Both merchant ships flood uncontrollably. The Power regains course and pings several active sonar tones to search. The Soviet sub is detected, creeping along at 5 knots, and it's laid out several more torpedoes aimed at the Power's reverse course. Thankfully, the ship has moved unpredictably, and they go wide.
Surface contact detected.
For now, the USS Power leaves the sub alone, not wanting it to know that it's been found. The 2 initial Mark 46s are treated as canaries and ignored. At the 2-hour mark of the engagement, the Orion drops its first sonobuoys into the water. The sub is quickly confirmed as a November-class attack submarine. It's loaded with torpedoes, but thankfully it's fairly noisy as subs go. Shouldn't be hard to keep track of it.
Surface contact detected.
While the Soviet merchant ships continue to burn, a trio of new Russian torpedoes is detected. The Power jags again, banking hard and firing off a noisemaker. The dance continues. The November makes a roundabout turn, hoping to throw me off from this torpedo's trajectory. The USS Power continues, banking, trying to zigzag closer to the November to put it within ASROC range. The ASROC will launch torpedoes into the air before they parachute down into the water just above the Russian sub. So, while it's got a shorter firing range than my Mark 46s, the Russian sub won't see these coming until they land practically on top of it. The Russian torpedoes arc toward the USS Power. They look wide. Grueling minutes pass. The torpedoes turn. That noisemaker didn't convince them. But they still look slightly off mark. The November loses confidence in its salvo of torpedoes and powers up, heading toward the Power to unleash another salvo. The USS Power slows engines to 1/3. But the torpedoes hear them. They turn again. They're not done yet. The Power fires off another noisemaker in desperation. Too little, too late. Despite the harsh angle, 2 of the 3 torpedoes find their mark, nailing the propulsion and aft of the destroyer. Crews race to engage the November, which is now in range of the Power's weapons. The Power dumps 4 torpedoes and 4 ASROCs toward the Russian sub. If they're going down, they're taking that sub with them. The Russian sub also dumps 4 more torpedoes into the water. The Power is sinking. All hands begin evacuation while the rest of Task Force 22 continues to race at flank speed to join the fight. The ASROC torpedoes hit their release point and drop silently into the sea. As soon as they hit the water, the November picks them up. It dives, turns, and fires off several noisemakers. 1 torpedo is fooled, but the 3 find their mark. The November is paralyzed. It attempts to surface when the final ASROC launched torpedo wanders back into them. Air vents explosively and the submarine sinks. Silence falls on the Cordon line as the USS Powell disappears beneath the waves and the Russian November-class sub fades into the abyss, sinking to the very floor of the Atlantic Blake Plateau. But the fight isn't over yet. The Orion resumes radar sweeps of the inbound warships, and the Galveston and Brownson close the distance, receiving notice of the powers sinking and marking their last known location for rescue craft. The two groups of warships enter range of one another's weaponry. The Galveston initiates.
Bulldog away. Track 704.
The first missile is distracted by Russian chaff.
Contact faded.
The second has more luck. It makes it past two counter-fired missiles and finds a home. It sets off the Russian destroyer's forward magazine, igniting secondaries and rewarding the crew of the USS Galveston with some fireworks. Fire rips through the enemy destroyer, consuming the central portion. The magazine explosion of the ship's fore section blew a sizable hole at the waterline, and the ship's sinking progresses rapidly. Meanwhile, the Galveston switches targets. A second Russian destroyer is in sight. This destroyer locks the inbound Talos missile too late. The chaff is ineffective, so it engages with its AK-230 Seawiz to no avail. The ship is struck rear starboard, setting off secondaries and immediately compromising the vessel. These secondaries spread, and the main mast is blown to pieces. Second target sunk. The Orion quickly tags the final two radar contacts as a pair of heavily laden Soviet merchants, making their final sprint for the blockade line. Galveston tasks two more missiles to the job.
Bulldog away. Track 7050.
Without their escort, but still refusing to turn back, the merchants are destroyed.
Track 7048.
As the sun sets, the gravity of the situation sets in. A US destroyer lost, but twice as many Russian ones lost, plus one attack sub. The situation at Cuba has gone dynamic. Who moves next and what they do is unclear, but this is the start of something. And whatever the US does next, it's certain to make sure that the Soviets pay tenfold for the sinking of the power. But for now, the quarantine has held.